So my name is Reem Asil. I am a trainer with the DataCenter, and I'm going to be explaining the Knowledge Factory tool, which is a common tool that we use with our partner groups, training participants to really understand research justice and the way in which knowledge flows in our society, and particularly the structural inequities that are in place that prevent communities from either being heard or knowing the knowledge out there. Oftentimes in arenas, especially arenas where important decisions, policy decisions are made that impact communities' lives, the community voice is often dismissed. So as a result, dominant narratives are often misrepresent communities and what's important to them and what's valuable in terms of improving their day-to-day lives. And policies are often put in place that actually don't support communities and often negatively impact them. And so really the importance of us understanding in the way the knowledge flows in our society lies in our ability to actually assert our right to be heard and our right to know about the valuable information that impacts our lives on a daily basis. So we're going to talk about some of these institutions and some of the ways in which our communities get knowledge. And we do this through the form of the Knowledge Factory. Now the Knowledge Factory, we visualize it as a grid with multiple axes, and I'll explain the axes. So on the top of this visual is really where we mark the source of information. Right? So there's two kinds of sources of information. There's the grassroots, and on this side of the spectrum, there's the mainstream. And for every source of information, there's an audience that gets that information. So we have this on the bottom of the grid. Again, on this side is kind of our grassroots audience, right? And this is a spectrum all the way to the institutions, the mainstream audience. So on the mainstream side, on the kind of extreme side of the spectrum, we view these folks as our decision makers. They're our policy makers. Some examples, obviously, of these are elected officials, all the way from the local to the federal level. And all the people in that intricate institution of government that influence them, including corporate interests, corporate players, CEOs, think tanks, generally anybody who can influence decision makers. But these are the folks who put policies in place and control the way our society is run. These are the audience on this extreme side of the spectrum. So on the other side of the spectrum, we have what we exemplify as our community. So that's everywhere from our youth to our elders, from some of the institutions right here along this spectrum that we consider to be the grassroots. So our schools, our community-based organizations, our local labor unions, any folks who we consider to be kind of the folks we work with, right? So on the top hand, the sources of information, on the grassroots side, we at DataCenter put these in two really important categories that often get overlooked when we talk about sources of information. One is what we call cultural and community knowledge. So that is the knowledge that is intrinsically in our communities, that is carried on down to us through our elders, through our culture, through our ancestors, through written and oral history, right, that is constantly here at the top, right? And then there's more the experiential knowledge that communities face on a day-to-day basis. So that is the lived experiences that people face and experience. So examples of this might be people's experiences with racism, right, or poverty, or police brutality, right? The issues can be as specific or as broad as the communities that they lie in. But these are also sources of information that are really valuable and important and lie here in the grassroots. On the other spectrum, the sources of information that we often go to are kind of the more official sources of information that we rely on that actually impact the way our society is run. And those come from institutions like academia, education, our governmental institutions, our laws, our legal system. These are the things that we consider kind of official sources of information, legitimate sources of information that actually impact the way in which policy is made. Some examples of that are obviously our media, our laws, right? What's on the books, official reports from researchers and institutions like think tanks and public health departments and academic institutions. These are the things that we look to inform our decisions around how policy is made, right? So, and there's a whole gamut, right? And we see this as a spectrum, right? So all the way from kind of our lived experience to the officially documented sources of information that we can look to that guide us in either how to live our lives or how to run our institutions that inevitably impact the way that we live our lives. In society, there are very natural ways in which information flows. As far back as we can relate, our communities have been gathering and disseminating information. Some examples of this might be through our art and culture, right? Through public visuals of art, through music, through cultural activities, to more organized activities where we're actually door knocking and organizing and relaying information to our community members about what's happening in society. There are ways in which information flows in our day-to-day basis, right? At the supermarket, at the grocery store, in our churches, in our local congregations. So this knowledge is often flowing, and our grassroots is often receiving information from us, right? Whether we are an organization or an individual. So on the other end of the spectrum, knowledge is flowing all the time. And our decision makers are making their decisions based on a number of things, right? Some examples that we often see is reports on demographics, right? The census is a very common tool that's used to decide how resources are allocated. There are meetings behind closed doors happening all the time, right? And people are making decisions based on statistics, reports, right? What academia is coming up with in terms of their analysis on the current trends. Looking at all sorts of charts with numbers and pictures that we don't understand. Right? So this is happening all the time. So while this is happening, oftentimes our grassroots are never ever seeing any of this. But at times, some of the mainstream reports actually trickle, right? And folks in the grassroots will look to it. Some examples of these are our mainstream media. If we have access to print paper, to online media sources, right? Through kind of our day and age of social media, some of this mainstream information is being filtered through to our grassroots and impact the way in which they think about society and the way in which they make their own decisions. So the way in which knowledge is filtered through our society is often harmful, right? Because the actual really important information about how policy is getting made stays over here on this quadrant, while maybe some of the media that trickles that actually has implications for a community and controls the way in which they act is the only thing that gets filtered through, right? The narrative, the dominant narratives that may not necessarily be accurate, that may not reflect the actual experiential and community knowledge that lies here. At DataCenter, we refer to this phenomenon as our right to know. It's important that some of this knowledge that's often inaccessible to our communities actually trickles into our community in the way that matters, right? The more we know about the decisions that are getting made over here, the more we can develop strategies to actually base and organize around those decisions. On the other front, we obviously have knowledge that we know to be true, right? And when we work with our communities, whether we're doing formal organizing or informal organizing, we are often creating solutions to the problems that we know exist in our communities. And part of research justice is for us to be able to assert that vision and to legitimize that. And obviously there are people here that have the power to actually make decisions that we want them to be making, right? So we are often disseminating the information that we know to be true to our elected officials, our decision makers, people in society who actually have the power to influence these things. And we often do that in the form of loud voices, of organized collective action. And breaking through this barrier for our decision makers to hear our voice, to see them as legitimate, is us asserting our right to be heard. And the right to know and right to be heard are essential components of our vision for research justice. Oftentimes, when knowledge is flowing, it's actually at the expense of our communities, right? So if we don't know what people are doing at our expense, that's a form of oppression. When we assert our right to be heard, we're actually confronting power. And it's important because the confrontation of power actually works to realign relationships and redefine how decisions are getting made. And that won't happen unless we organize. We envision a world in which communities have unfettered access to the information that controls their lives, and where community knowledge and methods of the way that we disseminate information are seen as legitimate indicators of how policymakers make their decisions. And that the grassroots and the mainstream institutions are actually partners in creating a more just society for all. We also see the process of breaking those barriers as communities' right to self-determination. And this means that we need to be building our own independent research infrastructure to ensure that there's accountability to our communities, that the research that we're putting out actually improves the livelihoods of our folks. And we can only do that when we build our autonomous institutions for research. Part of our vision to get to research justice is really about the organizing that we do on the ground, right? And the way in which we organize that knowledge to actually assert our own power and impact change. And so we see research coupled with action as the essential piece of how we organize to turn this paradigm on its head.